Thank you, Mariah and Jane, for the introduction. Thank you for acknowledging the territory of the Hunkaminam and Squamish-speaking people. And I also want to acknowledge the assistance that I've received in putting this presentation together from the City of Burnaby Archives. The Archives is one of several partners within the city that operate the Heritage Burnaby website. So there's some bookmarks for the Heritage Burnaby website. I'll put them at the back here. And it's an incredible wealth of information about Burnaby history and where a lot of photographs, oral histories, video is placed. A really great resource. And if you've never been to the City Archives, it's right next door. It's here in the McGill Library. So just so you know that that amazing resource is here as well. So this is one of my favorite photos. I'm probably going to say that about like every photo. And it is a shaken shingle mill located on the shores of the Burrard Inlet. And the photo is, as you can see, taken sometime between about 1910 and 1914. We know that because the photographer J.W. Phillips, those are the specific years that he was active taking photos in North Burnaby. So North Burnaby obviously has been a homeland for thousands of years to Indigenous people. Newcomers did not become really interested in North Burnaby until the 1880s, because the Canadian Pacific Railway from Port Moody to Vancouver was extended in 1886, so that got people interested in the area. There was a lumber mill built at Barnett, so if you've been to Barnett Marine Park, you may know that there was a large lumber mill there at one time, established in 1889. They did not process logs from Burnaby. The logs were floated in Burrard Inlet from elsewhere and processed at the mill and then shipped out on the CPR. So they weren't really that connected to the community. And then, so Burnaby was incorporated in 1892, but a lot of the activity was more on the other end of Burnaby. There was an interurban railway that was built between Vancouver and New Westminster that followed approximately the line where the SkyTrain is today. So a lot of the newcomers were sort of attracted to that area. But people started to get interested in North Burnaby. There was quite a bit of logging that happened in North Burnaby in the 1880s and the 1890s. And when the logs were taken out, stumps were left behind, and there were people that would come and harvest those stumps and sell them to shingle mills. So that's where our little shingle mill comes into the story. And they were often Japanese, Chinese, South Asian, Indigenous people who would come and harvest those stumps. So I just wanted everyone to remember that Burnaby's always been a diverse place. Diversity isn't a new part of Burnaby's history. It's something that's always been there. And those shingle and shake harvesters in North Burnaby are just one example of that. There was a man named Chester Taylor who told his story to the Columbian in 1942, and he remembers there being a whole camp of Japanese and Aboriginal workers at Gamma and Albert. So just behind the McDonald's, there was this camp of people who lived there and were involved in harvesting the shingles. Newcomers became more interested in coming to North Burnaby when there were roads, perhaps not surprisingly. So an important transportation corridor was established in 1903. This is what is now where the Barnett Highway turns into Hastings Street. So a little less traffic, but a little more bumpy. So the road was actually built, there was a Hastings Street in Vancouver, but it only went as far as Renfrew. And then in 1903, they connected Renfrew through to Barnett, where that Barnett Marine Park is. And the reason was, there's a clue in this photo, electricity. Yeah, the reason was electricity. So their power was generated at the Bunsen Lake power station. It was brought across the inlet and then along this road, not destined for Burnaby, but this was about getting power to Vancouver. So sadly, this is a lot of Burnaby's story where infrastructure gets built to serve other places, highways and such. So this was built really to bring power into Vancouver. But it did bring some attention to North Burnaby. The other thing that happened was in 1908 they built a water line. So Burnaby still gets its water from Seymour Creek in North Vancouver. So that line was built in 1908, water from the creek. There's a big pipe that runs approximately under the Second Narrows Bridge, and it comes across, and again, to bring water to Vancouver, but we happened to benefit because we were next to it. So Burnaby officially joined that waterworks program in 1912, but by 1908 it was here in North Burnaby. And if you know the Burnaby Heights Park, so that land was originally set aside for the reservoir as part of the water system. Another important element that brought people to North Burnaby was the streetcar line. So in 1909, the Vancouver streetcar came as far as Boundary Road. So as of 1909, there became more interest in coming to North Burnaby. And then in 1913, it was extended to Ellesmere, so to serve Capitol Hill. And this is it at its terminus. So that the wooden boards you see on the ground are Hastings Street in 1913, and that is the terminus of the streetcar. So you can see Burnaby Mountain in the background, and you can find this view still today. Yeah. So you can see that this transportation infrastructure came ahead of settlements. This is sort of often a story in Burnaby where the transportation infrastructure comes first. I like to say the Burnaby was built around public transportation, so that's sort of a great accidental urban planning benefit that we have. But all these things together, the streetcar, the electricity, the waterworks, made North Burnaby an attractive place to live. So this photo jumps forward in time. This is, because I don't have an earlier one, this is the 1940s. So this is where the other end of the streetcar. So I showed you the terminus at Ellesmere, but this is the beginning of it at Boundary. So you had to actually get off the Vancouver streetcar and then transfer and get onto the Burnaby streetcar to go. So this was so the center of kind of the Hastings Street Business District was down there near Boundary because of the streetcar. And there's some really fabulous things about this photo that are going to relate a bit to our talk. So you can see the streetcar here. So here's the little streetcar. This guy looks like he's not appreciating having his photo taken. There's a sign in the background, which I didn't notice until I looked at it today, for Kwan Brothers, which was one of the Chinese-Canadian green grocery stores on Hastings Street, which I'm going to talk a bit about that later, and their phone number, Glen 0503. So we're going to talk a bit about that phone system and the neon sign. So there's a lot of fabulous elements in that photo that relate to the history of North Burnaby that we're going to talk about tonight. So there was, in general, a real estate boom in the area we now call the Lower Mainland between about 1909 and 1913. But it really hit North Burnaby because of all those things we talked about, the streetcar, the power, the waterworks. And so one of the first areas to develop they called Vancouver Heights. So that was approximately Hastings to the oceanfront and Boundary to about Gilmore. So we would now call that area Burnaby Heights, right? But it was a real estate development that they called Vancouver Heights because people wanted to live in Vancouver. So it was sort of a marketing ploy to call it Vancouver Heights. So this is an early ad for Vancouver Heights, more for your money than any other residential subdivision. The little sketch shows the inlet. There's some lots ready to build on. And work has already been started on a residence for C.J. Peter Esquire. And they're noting that there's the city reservoir to Seymour Creek and all of those types of reasons that you would want to live in North Burnaby. And this is the house of Charles J. Peter that is mentioned in the ad. Does it look familiar? You've seen this. It's a lovely landmark in the neighborhood. It's still there. It is Overland. So that mansion was built by Charles J. Peter, who was the manager for the real estate company that developed the Vancouver Heights subdivision. He built it in 1909, and it was meant to be a showpiece. They thought Vancouver Heights was going to be like the new Shaughnessy. It was meant to be a super exclusive neighborhood. They hoped that everyone would be building homes like this. They had covenants on the land, so things you had to agree to right on the land title. One was that you had to spend at least $3,500 on your house. This house cost $75,000. But $3,500 was still a lot. A modest house would have cost you maybe about $1,000 to build in those days. So it was significant. They also had a covenant that prevented anyone who was not of European ancestry from purchasing in the neighborhood. And of course, later when human rights legislation was brought in, those covenants were made null and void. But that was their goal for the neighborhood at that time. Their goal was not fulfilled in many ways. It did not really become an exclusive neighborhood. You'll still see some grand homes in that area, but mostly over time, average working people moved into the neighborhood and built houses like this. This house at 306 Esmond was built in 1925 for a blacksmith, Francois Comeau, and his wife, who came from Quebec in 1890 and built their house in 1925. It's a little craftsman. I think it's been raised up over the years. The basement would have been added at some point. And I also just love to point out the shingles. So back to our first slide with the shingle mill. So those shingles that we saw being made in Burnaby also became a material for a lot of the houses here. So this kind of more modest working community was the reality of Burnaby more than Overland. And this house is on our heritage inventory. So this is a house that the city is aware is out there, and we have it flagged as a building that's of interest to us. So if its owner wants to demolish it or do something, then the system's triggered so we can connect with them and talk to them about preserving the house. And Overland is one of our designated or protected heritage resources. So it was also just a chance to see you two ends of the scale of the types of houses that we consider to have heritage value in Burnaby. This is a class photo of the Gilmore Avenue School. The first public school was built in 1912. It was a little wooden school called the Vancouver Heights School. And then by 1913, there were so many kids that they built a brick addition to the school and renamed it Gilmore Avenue School. The little wooden building is gone now, but the brick addition is the building that we now think of as the Gilmore Avenue School. And their class photos are so fabulous. Really, I could just look at them all day long. One thing that's deceiving about school photos is that they do give the impression often that Burnaby wasn't culturally diverse. And that's because a lot of the Asian Canadians and Indigenous people who would have been coming to Burnaby may not have had families with them. And so the school photo doesn't tell the whole story. But I don't know if you can see this little girl with her braids. And I don't know, the moms in the audience can probably feel for me when you carefully do your child's hair on school picture day, and then by the time they take the picture, there's like all of this hair sticking out of their, yeah. I can sort of imagine. I also love that you feel like these clothes are probably sewn at home. The typical North Burnaby family would have been a dad who was the breadwinner, who maybe commuted out of town to an industrial workplace. Maybe he worked in Burnaby, and a mom who really had to stretch his income by having a backyard garden and sewing the clothes, and the kids would have helped out in the garden too. So it feels like you can sort of see that in Burnaby. I also really love this girl's bow. Like, I was just gonna say. Yeah. It's like a bit butterfly.
Yeah.
It's really quite grand.
It is.
Yeah. I also like that, like, this messy-haired girl and this messy-haired girl are on opposite sides. So I like to imagine they're friends who've gotten into trouble. You can see I think way too much about these things. But definitely, you know, Burnaby was growing by the time that this photo was taken sometime between 1920 and 1925. We probably dated it based on the fashion, I would guess.
One guy that was dressed like a sailor.
A sailor guy?
Yeah, right there.
Who was a little sailor guy?
Right on the second row. He looks like he's got a sailor outfit.
Oh, this little guy. He does.
Yeah.
Yeah. His mom did a good job. Very fun. The other community institutions that were growing in the early days of the neighborhood were churches. So this is probably taken in the basement at St. Nicholas Anglican Church, which was built in 1912 at 381 Triumph. There was a parish hall eventually built in 1920, but in the early days, all the community activities would happen in the church basement. And churches were some of those early community spaces to develop. In addition to meeting spiritual needs, they were the community hall, the place where you put on a play. They organized Boy Scouts and Girl Guides and all of that type of thing. And they played a really important role in Burnaby in the 1930s. Burnaby was hit really hard by the Great Depression of the 1930s, and they did a lot of work to provide charity and help for people in their community too. By 1912, the neighborhood had Presbyterian, Anglican, Baptist, Roman Catholic, and Methodist congregations that may have had a building or may have just been operating out of another space. And then in the 1920s, the Vancouver Heights Baptist Church building was built. There was a Salvation Army Hall as well on Hastings Street, and a United Church. And the United Church is still there. There's a sketch there of what it was going to look like when it was proposed. As you can see, they did a pretty good job of building it to look like that. So a lot of those churches are still there, but not necessarily with their same congregation. So the United Church, for example, this one here that was built in 1926, today has two congregations that mainly serve Chinese Canadian communities. The Heavens Bridge Church and the Grace Christian Chapel that both operate out of there. Or there's an Islamic Sufi church that operates out of the original Presbyterian church. So the buildings are still there, but the functions, the congregations that they're serving have changed a bit over the years. There also was commercial development that happened. So this is the wall block. This building's still here. It is down near Boundary and Hastings. And the cool thing, one of the cool things, so many cool things about North Burnaby, but the Heights has always been one of those places where there's been a strong relationship between the businesses and the residents. So the people who worked in these kind of shops and owned them tend to be people who lived in the neighborhood. The customers tended to be people from the neighborhood, and those connections were important in the past and continue to be important today. And
When
yeah.
did they add the hills in that area? Because anytime I'm walking in that area, it's either uphill or down. This looks so far.
Yeah, I think it's an optical illusion. Yeah. I don't know, so the older I get, the bigger the hills seem to get though, so maybe that's happened to you too. And there were also a lot of apartments and rental housing on Hastings Street. So you can see apartments above these buildings, and that was a pretty common thing. Hello?
How was it called Arthur Wall Block?
That Arthur Wall must have been the developer. Yeah. There's a Regent block too, and I haven't figured out where the Regent name came from, maybe if it was the name or whatever. Sometimes the names kind of get lost to us, but that's what I would imagine. Another thing that you had in North Burnaby was a telephone exchange. So this is the Dexter Exchange, but the one that was in North Burnaby was the Glenburn Telephone Exchange. It was established in 1925 at Hastings and Carleton. So right where the Waves coffee shop is today was the Glenburn Telephone Exchange. And you probably see that name Glenburn, right? You still see Glenburn and business names. It's because of that telephone exchange number. There would be a word and a number for your phone number. So the Glenburn exchange, and it really doesn't mean anything other than that the Burn is Burnaby. It was sort of just a name that they created, and it stuck over time. So in the early days, so none of us remember this. We're all too young to remember this. But in the early days, you couldn't make a call without it going through the switchboard. So you would have to crank the phone to let the operator know that you wanted to make a call. And then you can see them with the wires. They'd have to physically plug your phone line into another phone line to complete the call. So phone operators were vital to the phone system. And as you can see, they're all ladies. So the work of the phone operator was regarded as women's work. And when we look at the directories for the Hastings Street area, there's a lot of apartments and boarding houses, and there's a lot of single women living in the neighborhood. So some of them may have been here because of this, because of being able to work at the telephone directory. Sorry, at the phone exchange. Yeah.
At what time did this system stay like?
How did? Yeah, I'm gonna show you a picture. The next slide sort of talk a little bit to that. So by the 1950s, they had the technology to have dial phone calls, but it didn't all change at once. So it didn't come to Burnaby, or at least to this part of Burnaby, until 1959. So in 1957, they closed down the Glenburn telephone exchange and moved it to Delta and Parker. They built all the technology, but it just took a little while to transition everybody into the new system. And the system had, your phone number had two letters and then 5 digits. So everyone's phone number in this area started with GL for Glenburn. So that word sort of went on. Cyprus. Okay, is that on the map?
No, I think that came after Glenburn.
It must have been like an amalgamation of some of them that came later. Did you dial CY?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's 29.
It was 29. Okay. Okay. So this was a little map that appeared in the phone directory of 1958, trying to explain all of this to everyone, because it took a lot of education to make that transition over. And then this was just an ad showing that Glenburn 2294, just that number at the bottom of the page. So how the telephone number was sort of implemented over time. That was kind of an aside, but I thought it was fun. I wanted to share it with you. This photo is taken in the 1960s, but this business was started in the 1920s. It's the Burnaby Market, and it's a greengrocer. So by the 1920s, 1930s, the Heights neighborhood was, pretty much a complete community. We've talked about houses, churches, businesses, schools. They've got everything. And most of the businesses are the kind of business that you would walk to and buy your everyday needs. So shoe repair, greengrocers, grocery stores, dry goods stores, hardware stores, bakeries, those types of things you're finding in the neighborhood. So the Burnaby Market is one of the greengrocer stores. So greengrocer is a separate category of business. It has separate business licenses, separate business license fees. It's separate from grocery store or general store. And almost all greengrocers were owned and operated by Chinese Canadian individuals. So it was sort of its own category of business. They sold produce, fresh produce, some fruits and vegetables, and there's several in North Burnaby. We saw the Kwan Brothers store earlier. The Burnaby Market was owned by a man named Wong Chu Yuen. He appears in the directory at 3942 Hastings in 1935 as the business owner and also as a resident. And if you look behind the Burnaby Market, you can see a large building behind. So this was probably a large residence. So it was common that Chinese Canadian business owners at that time would bring their friends, sponsor their friends and kin from China who could come and work in their business and get settled, maybe live in a place like this, establish their own businesses, and then also support other friends and families back in China at the same time. So the Burnaby Market would have been part of that process. And entrepreneurship was great for Chinese Canadians because they faced a lot of discrimination in the workplace. It was totally legal to pay them less. They were often assigned more dangerous and precarious work in their workplaces. So businesses offered a better way to make a living. Popular businesses in Burnaby for Chinese Canadian people were greengrocers and also farms. So there was lots of Chinese Canadian owned farms in Burnaby, especially in the Big Bend area down by the Fraser River. And often the greengrocers and the farmers had relationships so that they were working together to bring that produce to market.
What's the location of this?
It's 3942, the 3900 block. I'm trying to remember what's in the 3900 block today. Ingleton, yes. Yeah, right in that area. On the 4000 block at 4092 was Y Hoi produce owned by Yen Hoi, Hoi Yen. He shows up both ways. What I like, so this ad's from 1950, and right in the center of the ad, fresh fruits and vegetables from our own farm daily. So this ad is just showing that relationship between being a greengrocer and a farmer.
Free delivery.
And free delivery. It's great. The Burnaby Market's in this photo too, actually, which again I just sort of noticed today. So this is an earlier version of it in the same location but a smaller storefront and without the building behind. So this is the 3900 block in the early 1930s. So it's about, we think Ingleton, the crowd. The crowd thinks the 3900 block would be about Ingleton.
Would be the north side.
I think it's the south side. Yeah, I do think it's the south side. Yeah, there's an early Safeway. So Safeway shows up in the community directories in about 1931. So that's how I dated it to the early 1930s. But we see grocery store, dry goods store, greengrocer, shoe store. So those little local businesses that I was talking about are there. And you can also see the streetcar track out in front of the street, and that the road is paved by then. So the little community is starting to grow. This building was on the other side of the street. It's at 3915 Hastings Street, and it's still there. And the little drawing down below is from a fire insurance map. So fire insurance maps are great sources of information for historians because they draw out the buildings and tell us what's going on. So we could see that there's some commercial space and some apartments. This is one of those many, many mixed-use buildings that you saw along Hastings Streat. Oh, okay, it's not too far from Boundary. Yeah, it's maybe 2 blocks up. Yeah. Even when I look at the directories in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, there were often doctors and dentists' offices. So that continued later on then, that it was a space for a doctor's office. Okay. Yeah, interesting. There's a really cool little low, I had to contain myself with my slides, but just east of it too, there's sort of a low green building that's some sort of like cannabis supply store or something now. And it was built in the 30s as like, for the taxi company. So it was this sort of sleek and modern building in its time. So if you look, this stuff is still here. The Regent Theatre is another building that's still there. I'm gonna jump ahead. So that's the Regent Theatre today, the large brick building. It's now the Regent Block and the original theatre. Oh, going way too fast. Has been covered over, but this is outside the Regent Theatre much earlier on. This would be a band performance. So the theater wasn't just a movie theater, it was a kind of a community performance space. Again, I just love, like, you could spend all day looking at these kids and imagining their stories. But this one was built in 1926, and soon after that they put the original Heights movie theater out of business because the Regent started out with a big fancy pipe organ, and then it got sound for the talking movies, right? So it was originally silent movies, but when they got the technology to be able to have the talking movies, that was it for their old competition. And their old competition at 3888 Hastings became a vaudeville hall and sort of community space called Cully's.
They have their name, Gary Cooper's there.
I guess they're advertising the movie stars, perhaps, yeah. Or impersonating them, I don't know, how fabulous. I never noticed that before. Yeah, Gary Cooper doesn't look very happy. Yeah. There they are. Maybe they're going in a parade or something. Oh, actually, there's a poster for the background too. North Burnaby's Juvenile Band. There they are. Yeah, so that's the Regent building today. It's still there. It's hidden under this sort of modern brick facade. And this little Money's Dry Cleaning on the corner, you can still see some of its tile. So in the 70s, it was the Popular Cafe, and it had this nice pink tile face on it, and it had a bunch of backlit signs that said Popular Cafe. And look, one of them's on the roof. So if you're ever in that area and you kind of peek at the right angle, you can see the AFE of cafe. They've kept their sign.
Yeah, they just tilted the sign down.
Yeah, it's a Thai restaurant.
Yeah. So it's kind of fun discovering these little pieces of the past when you're walking the neighborhood. And this is another one of those buildings that you would sort of walk by without thinking anything of it. It's in the 1931 directory as modern shoe repair, and there was business on the ground floor and apartments on top. And it's really fun to actually go behind these buildings, to walk down the alleys, because that's when you see all the little apartments and back alley houses and all of the places that people lived. And people still live, right? That residential and business connection and rental housing, all of that is still there.
It says 3,200 dollars, that's 4,200.
It is, you're right, I have a typo. Okay, it is absolutely 4228 Hastings. I don't have a before picture. It's one of those ones that that doesn't seem to have been photographed. So 1931, modern shoe repair, and we know from the community directory that the cobbler, Arthur Gilmet or Guimet, lived in the apartment upstairs. He was a single man in 1931. He was no longer single in 1934. He married a widow who we can see in the directory also was a renter of an apartment in the area. Perhaps they met at church because they were married at St. Helens Church in 1934. And then they disappear from the community. But you think about how sort of, what a small kind of world and how community-based this would have been for Arthur, that where he lived, where he had his business, where he went to church, where he met his wife, all of this was in like a 3 or 4 block radius right here in North Burnaby. I also wanted to throw it in to remember, because sometimes when we think about the past, we think that like everybody had, you know, a husband and a wife and a house and 2 kids, but like the past is, just like today, the past is much more diverse than that. And it's good to remember that there's folks like Arthur out there too. Part of how we know what we know about North Burnaby is because they had a really fabulous newspaper, the Burnaby Broadcast. And it was just the North Burnaby newspaper, right? So we live in this kind of world of media conglomeration, right? Where there's fewer and fewer community newspapers all the time. And it's wild to think that there's a whole newspaper just dedicated to North Burnaby. And the masthead says, yeah, this paper is owned and edited by residents of North Burnaby. A man named Conway Brown started the paper in 1926. The paper's printer bought it in 1934, Francis Williams. Both of them lived in North Burnaby, owned this business in North Burnaby. The North Burnaby Board of Trade shared offices with them, so North Burnaby had its very own Board of Trade. And there were some apartments in the building too. And the other sort of the primary media outlet at that time was the Columbian in New Westminster, which had a fairly conservative political outlook. The Burnaby Broadcast, on the other hand in North Burnaby has a much more left-leaning view of the world in terms of the political candidates that they talk about. There's lots of local news. There's lots of advertisements. I love this one. So this is 1926, and we have a brand new bungalow for sale for $3,000. So it's sort of a tiny house. It's only got 4 rooms, but that's okay. I'd take it too. The Burnaby broadcast, by the way, did end up closing down I think it was in the 1950s, and I just had to share the quote from the owner. He said that owning a newspaper had left him richer in experience, but poorer in pocket. Another North Burnaby newspaper took over from it, the Burnaby Advertiser, which ran till 1963. We spent a lot of time using the Burnaby broadcast to learn about Burnaby in the 1930s. One of the talks is Songs of Resistance, which we'll talk about, like left-wing protests and resistance in Burnaby, and I will talk lots about the Depression there if you're interested. But I did just want to throw up this picture of Bill Pritchard of North Burnaby, who the good citizens of Burnaby elected in 1930 to represent them during the Depression. And he managed to hang on until 1932 as our reeve, or what we would think of as a mayor now. One thing he did was he opened a municipal office in North Burnaby, where Chaffee's is now, the former home of Helen's children's wear store. Because North Burnaby people felt very separate from the rest of the municipality, which you already would have a sense of because they've got their own newspaper and their own board of trade and all those things. But just all the transportation networks ran east-west, and it was really hard to get from North Burnaby to the municipal hall, which was in Edmonds. So opening that municipal office was a way that he wanted people in North Burnaby to feel more connected to their municipal government. Of course, in the Depression, it ended up mainly being the relief office, handing out relief payments to the unemployed. Burnaby recovered in the 1950s to prosperity, and this is the first kind of suburb as we would know it, suburban kind of housing development at Willingdon Heights. So this is on the west side of Willingdon. Let's see, did I write down the cross streets? Yeah. Between Gilmore and Willingdon, and Parker and Gravelly. So there were 550 homes built on 120 acres of land there after the Second World War. The Burnaby's population tripled between 1941 and 1961, went from about 30,000 to over 100,000 people. And a lot of that were people coming to live in these kind of suburban developments. Previously, all of North Burnaby's development really was focused along Hastings Street, so between Hastings Street and the inlet, and a little bit to the south of Hastings Street. But otherwise, between Hastings and Central Valley was largely farms and large properties. So that changed after the war with Brent Lawn and those types of developments, and the Willingdon Heights development too. And it saw the kind of commercial focus of Hastings move out of boundary. The streetcar closed down too. The streetcar shut down in 1949. So the center of town really moves up the hill more to that center that we know now. So this is the Valley Bakery, opened in 1957. This is its original location, which is right across the street from where it is today. They moved 4 times just to end up right across the street. The man on the left is George Kyer, who brought his family from Holland after the Second World War. His business partner is on the right, although I think my favorite person in this photo is that lovely lady. I mean, who looks like that to go shopping? So it really just sort of shows this sort of era of the 50s, of the suburban housewife. This is sort of a different character happening to the community here. And I love her shoes. Yeah.
Kyer is his name, is that
Kyer.
Still his family?
Yeah, so his son Jack took over the business in the 1970s, and I cannot remember I think the boy in the photo is not Jack. I think it's Jack's brother. I wish it was Jack. I couldn't confirm that before I came tonight. Sorry about that. But this is the Valley Bakery a little bit later on, and the Valley Bakery marketed itself in the 1970s as the Happy Bakery. And they were known for the friendliness of the girls on the front counter. So it was sort of that era where like the men worked in the back doing the baking and the women worked in the front smiling and being happy with the customers. And unlike the old days of the telephone exchange when you had to quit when you got married, it was a new day was dawning by the 1970s, and moms and older women could continue to work, as we're seeing in this photo. So, and I just love their uniforms, the little aprons and the clean dresses, the pearls, wearing pearls to work, really fabulous.
They look like waitresses.
They sort of do look like waitresses, don't they? Maybe they moonlighted at the Popular Cafe, I don't know. There they are. And the Kyer family and other families established businesses that we probably now think of as the old businesses, right? We think of Valley Bakery as one of the old businesses. That's Jack on the right. On the far left is Vera Banner, who opened a Del Rey florist. So that's a business that's moved further east, but is still there. That is Larry French. Behind Vera, who was one of 3 generations who owned the Robertson hardware store. And that's Mayor Copeland is the other gentleman, and the young woman who is Miss Burnaby. Unfortunately, I do not know her name, but I thank her because she is wearing a banner with the date on it. So we know this photo was taken in 1989. It's Hats Off Day. I don't know why you wear a hat for Hats Off Day. I'm puzzled by that. But it's one of the events that's been organized for a long time. Okay. Oh, because you're supposed to take the hat off. Okay. There you go.
The merchants took their hats off to their customers.
The merchants are taking their hats off to their customers. Okay. So the Merchants Association was founded in 1954, really to kind of boost business activity to the heights. And eventually they would become quite active in doing things like fighting against loss of parking spaces and those types of things too. All these folks were like the big players they were very active. So was Helen Arnold from Helen's Children Wear, and so were the Frenches of Regent Fish Market. So who doesn't love a clown and a fish? Why wouldn't you? So Eddie Wood was a compatriot of Vera and Jack and everyone. His dad.
That's still part of Hats Off Day because there's somebody wearing a hat.
Oh, there you go. And it's also on Hats Off Day. And so the Regent Fish Market is still there, not owned by the same family anymore. It started out as the Regent Meat Market. It became the Regent Fish Market in 1944. Somewhere around 1947-48, the Woods family buys it. Eddie Wood Sr., when he passes away in 1960, his wife takes over the business, and then eventually his son, Eddie Wood Jr. So they were quite active with the Merchants Association, as I mentioned, and a great store, and a great neon sign. And you cannot talk about Hastings Street without the Admiral Hotel. It was so It was like a super fancy place when it opened in 1956. It was only the second place in Burnaby to have a liquor license ever. The first was the Astor Hotel on Kingsway. And all of the architecture and the decor was intended to feel like a ship. So you see the portals in the upper photo. There's sort of a dinghy in the lower left photo, all of those types of things. So it was quite the fancy place. It grew less fancy over time. It enjoyed some notoriety as the North Burnaby Inn, which is what its name was changed to in 1982. And now they are operating as the Admiral Hotel again. And there it is. And this is my last slide because these are two really great landmark businesses, the Bob's Sporting Goods and Helen's Children Wear. So 4150 is Bob's Sporting Goods. Bob Goebel was the owner of that store from the 1950s through to the 2000s. The store closed down around 2012, 2013. And you might be happy to know that most of the Bob's sign is in the collection of the Burnaby Village Museum now. The Bob's at the top and the bear, which is hand painted, I think. The sporting goods little thing to the left I don't think that made it in, but the rest of it is there.
There were old skates and golf clubs found upstairs in the attic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I worked over there.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay. Fabulous. So yeah, that was a real enduring part of the landscape there for sure. And Helen's Children Wear at 4142. So that location wasn't her original location. She started out somewhere else at 4138 in 1948. She had a neon sign there too. And then when the old Burnaby municipal offices moved out in 1955 to the new Burnaby Municipal Hall, that space became available, and she and her husband purchased the building and moved their business into it and commissioned the Swinging Girl sign from the Wallace Neon Company. And of course, when Helen and her husband decided to retire from the business in 2007, the municipality was able to acquire the sign. So it now says Heights instead of Helen's, and through a partnership with the Burnaby Heights Merchant Association, that sign is still in operation to this day. And I like to sort of end the presentation with this slide because it's in thinking about that sign and the girl swinging back and forth, because it just reminds us that history is always changing, that the character of a neighborhood is always in motion. And some of the things that we saw on the slides today are still there, and some of them aren't. But I think, this neighborhood is a place that has maintained its character over time, and that sign's a good symbol of that. So that's the end, but I'd be happy to answer questions.
Did you check across the street from Helen's where Eagle Ford was? Is that a big neon for...
Yeah, I did have a picture of that in the slideshow, but I had like 50 slides and you'd still be here until 11 o'clock at night. So that was one that I ended up cutting out. But the Eagle Ford sign went... So there's a lot of ways that there's a lot of neon signs, I guess, out in the universe. So thankfully someone acquired the Eagle Ford sign, held on to it for a number of years, and then the city was able to acquire it. So we own that sign now, and the Burnaby Village Museum has stewardship of that sign. We'd love to see it reinstalled at some point because it really is fabulous. And it's in pretty good shape.
There's a Facebook group called If You Grew Up in Burnaby. So there are a lot of pictures that kids, parents who have passed away or whatever, they're starting to post all these pictures online.
Oh, okay.
And there's lots of the Ford dealership there.
Okay.
Great conversation with the pictures too, right?
Okay.
Post something and then somebody will say, "That's my uncle" or whatever, and then.
Okay. If you grew up in North Burnaby, is that what it's? If you grew up in North Burnaby, okay. I'll have to join it. I found the. Do you remember Does anyone remember the Dragon Inn where the Crystal Mall is now? So I found the head of that sign is at the Vancouver Museum now. So. That's kind of wild how these things reemerge over time. I don't know why just its head. There you go. All right. Well, we should probably end the evening. I will be around for some further questions if anyone wants to stay a bit longer. But thank you so much for coming out this evening. It was really fun.